While the ongoing pandemic has posed huge challenges for us at PVPA to stay connected as a community of students and artists, our becoming familiar with how to do that while not together physically has actually opened doors. The Visual Art and Technical Theater Department has taken this opportunity to reach out to a network of artists that extends far beyond our region. Each week we'll be talking with a different artist who will share stories of their path to and through the arts. And in doing this, our students will get a chance to see where the work that we do at PVPA might lead them in the future. Folks, today we have a very special guest, and unlike the others, is a very familiar face. But one of the things that we recognize is that, you know, many of our students have the opportunity to work with Petula Bloomfield, and at the same time have no idea about the work that she does outside of the classroom. And so today's a very special day to hear a little bit about her journey, how she got pulled into making art the way that she does, and to find out a little bit more about what motivates her. So Petula, welcome, thank you. And I would first like to ask you to go back to the beginning, right? If we think about who we're talking to, you know, when did you feel the calling, or like how did you get started doing what you do? And you know, tell us a little bit about your path that brought you through the arts and finally to join the PVPA community here.
Thanks, Martin. Well, it starts way back. The calling happened as soon as I could hold a pencil. So my recollections are I was 3 or 4 years old, and I started to draw on the walls of the house. And I grew up in England, and at that time, and this was decades ago, everybody's house, every room in the house was wallpapered, okay? And my parents had painstakingly wallpapered every room in the house. And then along I come with a pencil, and I draw all over the wallpaper in every room. And that continued until I left home at the age of 19. And it got to the point where my parents said, well, why don't you just wallpaper your bedroom with drawing paper? Which I did, including the ceiling. And I just kept re-wallpapering it, and after I'd drawn over every single plane of the room. And, you know, that was just how it was. There was no stopping me.
So aside from your childhood home life, how did your interest in art start to develop in a sort of more formal education?
Yeah. So my grandfather decades ago started a small printing business in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon in England, where I grew up. And my father took on the business, and it was a small letterpress printing factory. And they needed an artist to draw illustrations for anyone who needed a visual image as part of what we were printing. And so I guess I started doing illustrations for the printing factory, maybe at the age of 7, 8, something like that. And that happened until I left home when I was 19. I just did it, you know, any illustration, and it could be anything. It could be animal pictures. It could be graphic images using type, text. Sometimes there were full suits of armor that I had to illustrate. And what happened was I would draw all of that with ink on a sheet of paper, and we would send it out to a block maker who would come every day to pick up my drawings for the factory. And they would take them to this etching place, and those drawings would be etched into zinc plates, and they'd be returned to our factory. and then we could print those images.
And how long? So you said you started that at 7. How long was that your major outlet for creative expression?
Oh gosh. It was an important part of our business, so whether I wanted to or not, I had to. But I think as far as creatively, in addition to that, I was always drawing, mostly drawing, either with ink or pencil. I was telling my students the other day in my classes, when I was their age, I used to go to the library every week and take out all the photography books I could find. And some of the photography books were on the Vietnam War. And so I would just copy the photographs and draw all these people who were in the armed forces in Vietnam. When I took my final exam for my A-level in art at the age of 18, I did a painting which took a couple of weeks, and it was inspired by some of the wars that were going on around the world at that time. It was very figurative, very detailed, and it was done with acrylic. The other thing I would do was take out books on the masters, like Michelangelo in particular, and copy Michelangelo's drawings. Leonardo too, Leonardo da Vinci. I always found that was such an interesting exercise to copy a master's drawing. There's nothing quite like understanding how that drawing was made. So I would do that endlessly.
So we're getting a question about what are some of your inspirations for your art?
Well, I'm going to share my screen, and thank you for asking that question. And please ask questions whenever you would like. I hope you can all see that.
Yes.
Okay, so so I'm self-taught as an artist. I never went to art school, but I always drew with pencil, and I had to figure out how to do shading and how to make things look realistic. And so this technique is just scribbling. And I'm just pretty much working an unbroken overlapping line to develop all the different shades. And as far as my inspirations, a lot of time my imagination and my British background, I think this is so British. I sort of imagined this lady having a cup of tea, and I named her Elizabeth, and the name of the drawing is Tea with Elizabeth. And so to me, I imagined what she was thinking about as she was having tea, that in the chair at the table that she's sitting with, there's an apparition of Queen Elizabeth I, who kind of shows up. And then on the wall in the background, I've got an image of Elizabeth I on a painting here. The clock was significant, and I don't remember why, but it was 10 minutes to 12, and that was significant. The dead flowers were significant, and the covered piece of furniture here was significant. I was always very much in my imagination. This is another drawing. I don't know where it came from. I think it was just floating around in my head. And I must say that copying the old master's drawings really helped me to be able to draw from my imagination. And so here I've got this lady getting her hair done in a hair salon, back in the day. And she's imagining, and she's looking at this character who's sitting under the dryer, who is Marie Antoinette. And so, you know, I have so many inspirations. There's so much that I find of interest, but these were, I'm going to come out of this, but these were early drawings. And yeah, the current inspirations, I'm going to share my screen and go into the painting phase here. This is my website. All right, and it's new, so it hasn't quite finished yet. For example, if we look at this image. Okay, so this painting I did, I was inspired by the artist Fragonard, who is a 18th century artist, European artist. And so I kind of reinterpreted this image of this lovely lady on a swing tossing her shoe. And excuse me. And so sometimes I'll take an entire painting by a master and reinterpret it, give it a whole new context. So this is what I did with this one. And folks, please interrupt if you want me to answer any questions.
Well, Petula, there was a question that came in through the chat that I thought was kind of interesting. Well, I thought very interesting. It was, when you were young and a young artist, do you remember people commenting on your drawings and what that experience was like? How did it make you feel, and how did it affect how you were engaging in the arts?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I have an answer for that question, because so what happened as soon as I got to school, primary school we call it, elementary school you call it here, people found out I could draw. And so I guess from the age of like 5 or 6, because we started school full time at the age of 4, I started drawing everybody's illustrations for their projects in school. And so there would be lines of students at my desk waiting for me to draw their illustrations. So for science class, we had to draw sticky birds, and, you know, or we had to draw squirrels or something. And so I had to draw everybody's, I had to at least get everybody's illustration started. And that happened all through school, all through my teenage years as well. And I was really happy to do it. So I don't know, it was just, that was the way it was. Texture is really important to me. I'm gonna, yeah, I love texture. So I'm gonna go to current work on my website here. Here's a painting, speaking of texture, and there's a story about this. And so my daughter lives in Los Angeles, and she was walking along the street and she came across a seed pod, which is this. And then she walked a few more steps and she came across a dead butterfly right here. And she put the butterfly into the seed pod and she took a photo and sent it to me. And I was so struck by the image that she sent me. I said, okay, that's a painting. And so I started this painting. And so all of my paintings they're all on paper because I love the surface of paper. And I grew up with paper with our printing factory. We didn't have many toys, but we had plenty of paper. And I've always loved the smooth surface of paper. And I love the way water-based paint moves across the surface of paper. And then after I've done the painting, I'm out painting either a panel or a stretched canvas. And some of these paintings are literally, they can be up to 15 layers deep with color. And I never, ever know what it's going to be before I start. I do find a starting point. If I go back to, all right, I'm going to look at something. Okay, we'll look at my my self-portrait here. I don't quite know how to get this into a full screen. So a couple of years ago, actually, the APE Gallery had a show. It was 50 women artists, local artists, who were invited to do a self-portrait. And I hadn't done a self-portrait since I was a teenager, and I'm 64 now. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I get to do a self-portrait in my 60s. Okay, so it's been a long time. Where do I start? How do I see myself? And it just came to me. I asked a friend of mine to photograph me leaping, because that's where you are when you're in your 60s. And so I started with this photo, and then I built this panel. It's a wood panel. It's about 5 feet tall. And this painting is on paper. So it all starts with paper. And I start with, this whole painting actually is acrylic. So I started dripping paint all over this piece of paper. So it goes, here's a piece that's still exposed here. And a lot of it is exposed in the figure here, that early dripping with the acrylic paint. And then I kind of block other parts out. So I painted over this hole with this gold surface here. All of these circles are collaged in. They're discs that I cut and painted gold. And then there's a lot of collage in the figure here because I get professional grade, archival grade prints made of my paintings. And I cut some of them up and use them as collage in some of the new work. So there are pieces of collage from prints of my paintings in here, and so on and so forth. Now, I realized when this was done, I didn't want it to hang on a wall. I wanted the portrait to stand on the floor of the gallery. So I asked Lisa Thompson, who's the director of the gallery, I said, look, I've got this portrait. I don't want it to hang on the wall. It needs to be standing. And can I paint the top of the hand onto the wall of the gallery? And she said, yeah, as long as we can paint over it when the show is done. And so this top of the hand here is painted directly onto the wall of the gallery. It was just fun. All right. Please interrupt me if you have more questions. I'd love to talk about this piece here.
Okay. And just one question that you can maybe address whenever it feels convenient is someone asked, when did you start teaching? Like, when did this shift into a part of your career? And I would also kind of toss in like this, because it's a big part of the story, is like, moving across the pond, as they say, isn't a small experience. And I'm very curious about how that affected your artwork and how you were sort of approaching that as a career or life path.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to go back to the past work. All the way, I'm going to scroll down here. All right. I guess I'm going to bring this one up here. So, Martin, you hired me, you and Laura Davis, in, I think it was 2004. And at that time, I had just graduated from a master's program at UMass Amherst. I actually have a Master of Science in Art because I studied architecture. And so that's what they gave me. I moved to this country when I was 20 years old to start a new life. I arrived here with a backpack and a suitcase, and that was it. And let's see, it took me in all kinds of directions before I applied for a job at PVPA. I arrived here in 1976. I found myself traveling back across the pond in 1980 to Israel because at that time I was married and my husband was studying in Jerusalem. He was studying Hebrew for a year. And I had a year in Israel and no plans. And so I thought, what am I going to do? Well, there was this school of archaeology, which looked really interesting. And they were digging up all this stuff at archaeological digs. And I thought, wow. And someone gets to draw what they dig up for archaeological publications. And so I walked into the head of the school's office, the president, Dr. Avram Biran, and I said, I want to apply for a job as an illustrator for the school. Well, he burst out laughing. And I thought, gosh, what's funny? He said, it takes years and years of training to become an archaeological illustrator. And so I said, well, I'm here for a year. And this looks really fascinating. And how do I get that training? And he was still laughing. He was laughing even harder. And he said, go talk to this lady. And apparently this woman had just retired and she was a master illustrator, had been for the school. So I walked across the city and I knocked on her door and she didn't know who I was. And I told him what I wanted to do. And she said, that's impossible. But I said, I begged her. I said, please teach me. And so she said, right, come back at 8:00 tomorrow morning. And I did. And then for 3 months, I studied with her every single day. And she taught me how to be an archaeological illustrator. And these were all drawings that were done to scale, and we didn't have computers then. We were measuring with calipers. We were reading all of the tiny bits of evidence on a tiny shard of pottery that they would dig out of the ground. And the illustrator would have to reconstruct it, both in a section and on the outside view of the pot. And at the end of 3 months, I had a little portfolio, and I went back to Dr. Avram Biran, and I showed him what I had done, and he hired me. And for the rest of that year, I was an archaeological illustrator, and it was the most incredible, incredible job. I didn't have any schooling. I had no degrees at that point. I had no college education or anything because I moved across the pond to this country at the age of 20. So that interrupted everything. But when I did come to this country, I started taking classes to get a degree in liberal arts. I tried everything. I just explored. I'm still as much interested in science as I am in art, and always have been. So I'm very, very curious about how things work. So when I applied for the job at PVPA, I was actually, I have to go back again, because my master's degree in architecture, I was inventing materials from waste products. Okay. So this is a product that I invented, which is made from junk mail. And so, I took junk mail and I put it in a blender in the kitchen. And I'm going to bring up a close-up here of this surface so you can see what it is. And I think, Martin, at the interview, I was showing you pictures of this.
Yeah, this is the work that you were doing right around that time, and
yeah,
also some of the more abstract paper pieces, and the piece you just showed, like the sort of dark silhouettes with the overlaid layers. That was like what you're moving into, like right as you were starting your time at PVPA. Anyway, so
yeah, and I brought some samples of this. So what I learned how to do, I was really interested in inventing materials that could be used in architectural applications. So I was building walls literally out of this pulverized junk mail. And I found a way to make it really hard, really deeply textured. I started building furniture with this stuff and selling it. And I was working with a carpenter who would do the finish work. I don't know. I've always invented. To me, growing up in the country and with not much money or anything, you play in the mud, a lot, and you play with natural materials and you play a lot with found materials. And so I'm still doing that. I'm still working a lot with found materials with the students, especially in the mixed media classes and the sustainable fashion classes, because I've been doing sustainable fashion, working with waste material for 57 years, because we had to make everything from scrap material. We could never go and buy anything new from a store. We didn't have any money. So I've been literally working with all this scrap and waste material all my life. And you learn stuff. You just learn stuff and you invent stuff. So this was part of a wall that I was commissioned to do for the new Sunderland Public Library. And so it was inspired by Mount Sugarloaf behind the library in autumn, the colors, and also the quilts, the quilting traditions in New England. They had to have this plexiglass panel is floating over the surface, and it has all of the names of the donors to the library etched into it. And I had I don't have, here's a little better. You can see this. So I wanted it to have texture as well, as it's floating over the surface. Also wanted to make sure that when children came into the library, they could run their hands over this whole wall and it wouldn't get damaged. And the whole history of the library is embedded in fragments that I took out of their file drawers from all of their meetings and their newspaper articles, the whole history of the library. They were trashing. So I said, give it to me. I'll build this wall with it. And so there are little scraps of information. The more you look, the more you can find about the history of the library. Yeah. Okay, and then I took that texture because I was talking about texture, and I started working on paintings. And so this is kind of where that texture was going into oil paintings. And these would all start on paper, again, with water-based acrylic paint dripping and flowing with no idea of where it would end up. Because I love the energy of water and I love the element of chance and not knowing what's going to happen. When I first started this process, I was working into it with drawing with charcoal and other materials, and I would just paint out what I didn't want showing and build the layering. And I'll bring up a couple more. Yeah, and things just, one would lead to the next one. They would just, I never knew what was going to happen. And some of these are fairly large. And these sold very well, by the way. I started having about 30 art shows a year of my work, and it was really exhausting. And I did that for quite a long time. Here, okay, talking about influences. So these are influenced by Renaissance portraits, which I would make a copy of a Renaissance profile portrait, go to the collective copies, and drag it through the copying machine. I spent lots of time at collective copies playing with copying machines. And it would distort the portrait. And then that would be a starting point after I'd done all this dripping to kind of evolve the painting into a portrait. And then quite a few of these happened. Thinking about Renaissance portraits. Yeah. So sometimes they, as I mentioned, the layering of the painting, I could get up to about 15 layers deep. And that's not easy when you're balancing fat over lean layers with a oil paint. This one has an interesting story. This is called Babel. So in 2007, I started a PhD program in visual arts because I saw this full page ad in Art in America magazine, and I had never been taught formally how to draw and paint. And in 2007, this was the first ever PhD in the visual arts in the country. And it was an independent institution, the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, and they're still going. And they were asking for applications, and they were going to allow 12 people in the country to be in this pioneer program. So I applied, but you needed an MFA in order to apply, and I didn't have it. I had a Master of Science in art. And so I called up the guy who was running this program, and I said, look, come on, you gotta be open-minded here, Anyway, he had a good laugh, and we talked for about an hour, and he said, okay, you can apply. And so I applied, and I got in. And Martin, you remember I had to get coverage for some of my PVPA classes that year because this PhD program was starting in Italy, in Tuscany, in a 1,000-year-old castle. And the reason I wanted to do it was that it was covering aesthetics, philosophy, and art theory, none of which I had studied formally, and I felt like I really needed. Anyway, it was an incredible adventure. The whole thing fell apart. I have no regrets. And after I left the program, I was the first dropout and the first PhD in visual arts in the US. I painted this painting when I got home from that. Yeah. Okay.
There's a question about how you come up with your wonderful titles, Slow Burn and Visitation, that need a little, reveal a little more about the piece.
Okay, great. I've always found titles to be very difficult. I'm going to talk about, let's see. Yeah, let's see. I have a little bit of a difficulty with writing statements for shows, and I did so many shows in a year, and I got so burnt out doing it. And finally, in my later years now, I have decided that I have the prerogative to refuse to write statements. So I no longer write statements, and I've always had difficulty writing, coming up with titles. And so very often I ask friends. I'll send the image, the finished painting, out to my friends and my daughter, who's a word meister. And they're really great with words. And so there's a little bit of a competition that goes on with my my close friends and my daughter to come up with titles. And I'm very happy to receive help from other people. And I think most of the time, that's how the titles come into being. This piece became the cover for a book of poetry, and was purchased by the poet. Yeah. Oh, there's a good story behind this one, Croquembouche. I was working at a bakery for 3 years, the Hennion Bakery in Amherst. And David Hennion he and his wife are the owners, they're still there. And he was building the most amazing pieces for weddings. And one of the most magnificent pieces that he built was called a Croquembouche, which is made out of sticky kind of puff pastries. And I was traveling across the pond. I usually, in the past, have traveled every year. And I ended up at Kensington Palace in London. And there's a beautiful orangery, which is part of the Kensington Palace, where they used to grow all the citrus for the palace. And now it's become a cafeteria. And in my dreams, I have always dreamed, especially when I moved from England to here, I've had this image in my head of a plate of scones piled high, and we call it scones. And it's just been there in my mind year after year after year. So I walked through the doors of this cafeteria at Kensington Palace, and there was this magnificent platter of scones piled high. And I couldn't believe it. I had to take a picture. And as soon as I got home, I painted this. So it's my version of the platter of scones. And in America, everybody thinks it's ice cream, which is, I'm more than happy to have everybody interpret it as ice cream. They can interpret my paintings any way they feel. So. All right. I am going to talk about this piece for a few minutes, okay? Because this is one of my recent paintings. This is painted earlier this year. It's a large painting. It's 64 inches by 20 inches high on paper, mounted onto 3 canvases. And so you can see the lines here. There's a line here, and there's a line here. And then I bolted the canvases together on the back. So some of you may know that my brother was killed last year, you know, and that's certainly something to go through. And so this painting and the one following it and more coming come out of that experience. And again, I never know what's going to happen or what I'm going to be painting. I've always been intrigued by the Bayeux tapestry of the Battle of Hastings, which was embroidered. Excuse me, I have to drink some water. In the 1400s, although they don't quite know when it was made, and it's always intrigued me. Now, this is a narrow 20-inch high. That's why this painting is 20 inches high. very long tapestry depicting the Norman conquest of Britain and the Battle of Hastings. So William the Conqueror coming across and invading our country and so on and so forth. And it's something exquisite. I think it's 128 feet long. And it was just beautifully embroidered. And so I've always been intrigued by that format for a piece of art, just very long and very skinny. And so when I did this piece, I thought, what would happen if you did a bunch of paintings that were long and skinny, and then you put them end to end in any order around the entire perimeter of a room, and they could fit any space, but it would be a continuous long skinny painting that would go all around the room. And every time you hung that painting, it would be in a different order. And so this is what I'm working on now. And I'm on number 2 of these paintings, and they seem to be flying, floating figures, and they're really, really fun. And so again, a friend came up with the title, Blown Away, because I needed help, because I always get stuck with the titles. And so Blown Away won the competition. There was a competition. and my friend in Sweden, who I grew up with, won it. Now, there's a lot of collage material, a lot of puddling of acrylic to start with. This whole painting is acrylic. So this took several months to paint. This whole top layer here that looks like lace and it's darker, that was a separate whole drip on another sheet of paper. And I really moved the paint around. And then I cut out all the spaces. And so this is a paper layer, which I pasted finally on top of the whole thing. Yeah. And there's another one on my bedroom wall, which is almost done, which is completely different.
So there's a comment, someone noticed that you often show old-fashioned shoes in those paintings, and they're wondering if there's a reason or just an affinity.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. The shoes. Yeah. So actually, thank you for pointing that out. So if I go back to the past work here, so take a look at this. I mean, look, okay. So I think this leg really intrigued me here. And I felt like that had to be continued. I love to dance. This one's called Fling, I believe. Yeah, Fling. And, and I love clothing. I've always been fascinated with clothing and costume and been making it all my life. And so, and I have my British history culture. So I guess it's all kind of spinning around in there. And that foot, that whole leg is continuing in this new series. And I've got in the next painting that is almost done, the shoes and the feet are continuing as well. And if you have any further explanation, I would love to hear it. Pretty much everything. the Renaissance is of particular interest to me because it was such a convergence of exploration, experimentation, and knowledge. And again, the scientific discoveries that were made have always been so intriguing to me. And I also feel like, if I ever lived any past lives, I was definitely around in the Renaissance. And I was a female painter. and they and they haven't received their due yet. So there's something wonderful to me about how the world and culture kind of opened up at that time. Yeah. And I'm still exploring that. I'm fascinated by today I showed a video to my students about the color blue, okay, which doesn't really exist in nature. Even when you think you're seeing blue, you're not. It's a refraction of light. And it's very, very rare that there's any blue pigment in nature that exists. There's only one place, I think, that it exists, and that's in a certain butterfly. But all the other blue butterflies, it's about the refraction of light and how blue is not absorbed by the surfaces of butterfly wings. I don't know. I mean, that just totally intrigues me. And I've also just taught my students about Vantablack, which is the blackest black that's ever been invented, through growing nanotubes on surfaces. So it's not a pigment. You grow it through nanotubes and you can cultivate it. And now it's being used in all kinds of the space industries. I may not have answered the question. I'm sorry. Okay. So I was at Edinburgh University starting to study art history there. And I met this American guy. And I dropped out of college and I became a youth hostel warden on the northwest coast of Scotland in an old World War II army bunker, which was converted into a youth hostel. And he and I spent some months together doing that. And we were 100 miles from the nearest town, and there were a lot of sheep up there. And he said, well, where do you want to live? Do you want to live in Europe or do you want to move to America? I said, I fancy America. So that was that.
And, that's so cool. That's just a wild story. That's so cool.
I think America really appealed to me because I was so sick and tired of history at that point. My town was an old Anglo-Saxon town and lots of Roman remains and all of that. And we were always digging stuff up. And at my family printing factory, I dug a hole when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I started digging up all this old Elizabethan pottery because I found out our factory was built on the old Elizabethan town dump. And I got all these clay pipes and all this Elizabethan pottery, shoeboxes and shoeboxes of it. It was really fun. And I went to a high school that was like Hogwarts. It was an old medieval manor complete with secret passages and priest holes and all the rest of it. I don't know. the thought of America was so intriguing to me. And I moved from Stratford-upon-Avon to Los Angeles. And talk about a culture shock. When I got to Los Angeles, I was so blown away by the width of the streets and the traffic and the tall buildings. I took hundreds and hundreds of photos because I fell in love with all of that modern architecture and the traffic. I just used to take photos of traffic when I first came to this country.
That's so cool.
I still got those photos.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
It was so brilliant. I loved it.
That's so cool.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. So
Okay.
I'm wondering if there are any burning closing questions for Petula. And one of the cool things about this conversation is it doesn't have to end. Most of you will have access to Petula. So the question that came in that I think would be a wonderful last point before we say goodbye for the day is of everything you've made, what is can you identify a most meaningful or a favorite piece that you've done?
Well, the wall was good in the library. I mean, they wanted a 5 by 5 foot piece for that competition, and I went and visited the frame of the library with a whole bunch of other artists. We were all competing and we had to wear hard hats, and I saw them framing this whole wall. And I said, well, no, why don't you just have the whole wall? I'm really proud of that piece. And when I won the commission, they said, well, we're not going to give you any more money. I said, I don't care. It has to be the whole wall. And then this final piece, the blown away piece, I really love it. And I love this whole idea of doing the end-to-end flying figures around the perimeter of the room. And someday it'll get there. It'll be finished.
And there's a nice little follow-up that I think was, do you have any goals for yourself as an artist and things that you want to make sure to achieve? Or do you have any particular advice that you would give young artists or yourself back when you were a teenage Petula?
Okay, at this age, I can safely say I'm very clear. If it isn't fun, I'm not interested. So, it's got to be fun. And so that's really important. So I do have fun. And I would send that out to my students as well. And get ready to mess up. Because it's the only way to learn, mess up. There was this wonderful story of an old man who's dying and his son is visiting him. And his son says, so Dad, what's life all about? And the dad says, I know 2,000 things that don't work. And the whole moral of that story is try it. If you don't try it, you're not going to learn, you're not going to have the experience, and the worst that can happen is that it won't work. And I have had gazillions of it doesn't work, and that's how it's going to be forever.
Wonderful parting words of wisdom. Thank you so much, Petula, for coming here in this fashion today.
Thank you, and thank you all. It's been a real privilege and an honor.